I've been involved in endometriosis research now for about 20 years, almost 20 years since I came to Australia from New Zealand. But I'm going to talk more generally tonight, I think, about the role of research, not so much in managing endometriosis, but in trying to understand it, which is really what we've been trying to do for the last 20 years. And for a long time, we worked hard but didn't make a lot of progress. What's really changed is that the technology has dramatically changed our ability to do some of the genetic research that we've been working on now for a long time. And so one of the really important things to understand is that it is a complex disease. And by that I mean that in a general sense, but also in a specific sense. And so it's one of those things that's difficult to understand, difficult to research, and there's some reasons for that. So it's caused by it's defined as a disease where there's lesions of endometrial-like tissue that grow outside of the uterus. The endometrium is actually that tissue that lines the inside of the uterus. So there are lesions or growths that occur outside, mainly in the peritoneum, as I'm sure you understand, but sometimes elsewhere. And it's characterised by different types of lesions and it presents differently. So one of the complexities is that, everybody has a slightly different presentation of it. And there's a very poor correlation between the presence of lesions and the symptoms. So it also makes it difficult to sort of understand and to know how to treat each individual. And so a lot of the treatment options have limitations, and that's partly because of this difference in presentation between individuals, but also because we really don't understand the causes of the disease. What we do know is that there are genetic and environmental factors that contribute to the disease. We also know that it's a serious disease and therefore deserves serious attention because it's difficult to get a good handle on what the prevalence is, like how many women are affected, but we think it probably affects 6 to 10% of women of reproductive age. Those are the best estimates. That the health costs are very similar to other major chronic diseases like Crohn's disease and type 2 diabetes, but it doesn't really receive the same level of attention, or hasn't until recently. And it's estimated that in Australia that probably the 6 to 10% translates into probably 500,000 women. And the estimates of the direct and indirect costs are about $6 billion a year. So it is a serious disease that deserves serious attention. I came to the IMB, I'd worked at QIMR for about 17 years, and I came here about 2 years ago. So a lot has happened in the last 2 years, I'm happy to report, both for us in our local program, but also nationally. And so for a number of reasons, there's been some change in the way that people have been addressing this nationally. And QENDO, and as Roddy said, I've been the patron of QENDO now for a few years, is one of the groups that have been working on patient support now for very many years. But in order to progress this, there's been the formation of this Australian Coalition of Endometriosis, for endometriosis, that's developed in the last year as the really peak body that puts together or has representation from all the other patient support groups around the country. And that is to try to address this at a national level. And so the Australian Coalition for Endometriosis has aims to provide strategic direction and leadership to improve the outcome, treatment and support for women with endometriosis. And you can go onto their website and you can see some of that. And this was partly in response to federal politicians forming the Parliamentary Friends of Endometriosis Awareness. And I've been involved along with members of QENDO and the other support groups in trying to progress this. And so we had a launch of the Parliamentary Friends in Federal Parliament on December the 6th last year, and there the Minister announced a national action plan for endometriosis, and then we had a meeting in February to actually have the first discussions about what's going to go in that national plan. And so there's a draft plan being put together from that, and that will be circulated for public comment soon. So, you know, that represents, I think, a huge step forward in the awareness of for endometriosis at national level, and has strong support from the Federal Minister of Health. So this key meeting of representatives from the Federal Department of Health, patient groups, clinicians and researchers met on the 19th of February in Melbourne. And really we're trying to address in the national strategy, so education and awareness, clinical management and care, and research. And so I'm going to spend the rest of my talk just talking about the research area, but all of these things are necessary to really make the progress, and I think having a national action plan should really change the landscape here. So what do we mean by research in endometriosis? What should we be doing? And so I've been part of a number of international consortia and international meetings to try to address this. But there was a big attempt in the UK and Ireland to try to come up with some of the top 10 research priorities. And so this was published in The Lancet last year and led by Andrew Horn, who's in Edinburgh. And they had a formal process where they went through and decided and tried to put together these top 10 research priorities. And this was done in this framework of this endometriosis priority setting partnership. And they used formal procedures to do this, to try to whittle down all of the things that you might think about that need to be done, and there are a lot of things that need to be done to get these research questions identified and agreed. And so it was a pretty big exercise. They started out with nearly 5,000 initial research questions that were submitted by over 1,000 respondents. And of course, there was overlap in these questions. And it was largely driven by patients with support from healthcare practitioners and other supporters. And so then they voted and ranked these and came down to a set of consolidated questions in a second survey. And from that, they whittled down to these 10 top research priorities. And I think they're things that we can mostly agree with. And obviously there's some overlap. Some of them are primary questions and some of them are secondary questions, but these are the top 10 questions that came out of that exercise. And of course, top of the list was, can we develop a cure for endometriosis? And the second is, what causes endometriosis? And then there's some other questions related to how can the diagnosis be improved, and what's are the most effective ways of managing some of the different symptoms, can we develop non-invasive screening, and so on. And so these are all, I think, really important questions. What I've been working on for the last 20 years is really what are the causes of endometriosis. And so I'm going to spend the rest of the talk mainly talking about that. But that's not to say that these other questions aren't important. But I think that understanding the disease is critical to addressing some of these other questions, earlier diagnosis and so on. So just kind of sort of taking some of those things and saying, well, all right, if top of the list is what causes the disease and can we develop cures, then one of the things we need to do is understand what the pathogenesis, or what's actually driving the disease, and using some of the newer techniques in genomics and functional biology to do that. And so this is the area that we've been working in what are the genetic factors that cause the disease, what are the genes and pathways that underlie that, and then if we can understand that, can we develop improved drug screening and better drugs for it. And so if we can understand this and get at the causes of the disease, I think that will lead to the translation of early detection, better prevention strategies, novel treatments, perhaps cell-based therapies, and how can we prevent recurrence of the disease, which is an important question. I think one of the areas that we've not really spent enough time on is another sort of subset of this, which goes back to the initial point that I made about the presentation is different for different women, and that is, is it really one disease, or are there sort of multiple forms of disease, which and can we understand that? And so I think that there's some of the new technology that's being developed can really address some of that. And so I would like to see a lot more work in this area and really addressing questions about disease subtypes and progression and recurrence. So talking specifically about our program, as I said, I've been working on this for 20 years. And it started initially with some observations by Susan Treloar, who was working at the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, that there's a strong genetic contribution to hysterectomy. And of course, that was, a little bit of a surprise, I suppose, but it shouldn't be, because, of course, endometriosis is one of the main causes that leads to that, or used to, and so it's really driven by genetic risk factors for endometriosis and also for uterine fibroids. Anyway, we started a big project with a generous donation from the Hawkins family that really gave us the initial impetus to start on that project. And so we did a major collection of what is still the largest collection of women in the world that has surgically confirmed disease. There are a number of other studies around the world now, and I won't go through the rest of it, but we got some funding from CRC for discovery of genes for common human disease, which allowed us to continue that. And that's been the basis of a lot of our work. And it really took us a long time to actually make progress, and that was because the technology has really improved. But just to show you that there's a couple of studies here that sort of separate out the effects of genes and environment. And basically, it's about 50% of the risk is due to genes, so we can use the genetics to try to understand it. The other 50% of risk is what we would call environmental factors, but we don't really know what they are in a lot of detail. And a lot of the epidemiological studies have not really shed a lot of light on that. But I'm hoping that if we can better understand this part of it, which is the genes that are involved, that might help us to design better studies which will help us to understand the environmental factors. And so, we apply the sort of modern techniques of genomics to try to understand that, and as I said, in the last 10 years, that has really developed to the point where we can make good progress. And one of the things is to use genetic markers to try to map the risks. And so since 2010, when the first studies were done here with about 1,400 patients, there have been a number of studies, and the most recent one that we led from here involves analysis of nearly 17,000 women with endometriosis compared to about 200,000 controls. And so the initial studies, in 2010, which was a Japanese study, identified one region. Our own studies in Europeans identified 2 regions. We conducted a meta-analysis of those 2, and we had 7 regions. The most recent study now has 14 regions and some secondary signals that we know are strongly associated with risk of endometriosis. And as I said, this study was conducted on 17,000 cases and nearly 200,000 controls. And this is just the sort of plots that we put, which of the genome starting with chromosome 1 right through to the chromosome 20 and the X chromosome here, and just showing that the number of regions that reach our cutoff for statistical significance. But the important thing to understand is that these regions don't point to one gene. What they point to is a region of genetic markers that spans a number of genes, and that could be anything from half a dozen genes to 50 genes. So we've still got a lot of work to sort through each of these regions. And so that's really what we're trying to do here at the IMB, is to really take these, so the initial data that we've got from these genome-wide association studies identifies all these regions. And so that's good, solid data that we can use as a basis to really now try and identify the individual genes in each of these regions that's contributing to endometriosis risk. And there's a bunch of experiments that we need to do to try to understand that. And we're starting to make some progress in that. And just to give you a bit of a flavour of that, if we just look at this region here, which is on chromosome 1, and we expand that out, then we get a plot that looks a bit like this. And so here's all the markers that are significantly associated with the disease, and there's a group of genes underneath. And so we're trying to sort through this region and find out which of these genes. There's a kind of really obvious candidate here that we know is involved in development of the uterus, and you'd think that that's the good candidate. But our data suggests that that's actually not the gene that's involved, but there's a couple of other ones. So, you know, we need to find these genes and understand what they do, how they affect endometriosis risk, and hopefully then have new targets for better therapies. So that's a kind of flavour of what we're trying to do. It's not straightforward, and there's lots of work that we still need to do. So what then are the future challenges? Well, we're trying to work on the top one, which is which specific genes affect risk and are they targets for new treatments. But we're also trying to use the genetics to begin to ask this question, is it one disease or are there different types of diseases? And then use this information to develop better studies to try to understand what the environmental risk factors are, because that'll be the stuff that is actionable. So that, if we could understand that, I think we would then be able to help in more direct ways. And then, can we use this to develop, can we use this new knowledge to develop non-invasive diagnosis, early detection, prevention, and better treatments. And so what we've really been doing is trying to understand the causes of the disease with a view, taking the long-term view that if we can do that, then we can really start to address some of these questions and hopefully have better treatments and also better ways of helping women with this disease, important disease. So finally, I'd just like to acknowledge all my colleagues here and in Melbourne, and also over at QIMI Berghofer that where I've worked with for a number of years now to address this. My colleagues in the International Genetics Consortium, major funding through the National Health and Medical Research Council, the US National Institutes of Health, UK Wellcome Trust, and generous donations from QENDO, and that are really, I think, helping us to make good progress. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.